I'm Bob Fowler. My wife, Debbie, and I have attended Trinity Cathedral for 20 plus years. So I've been doing classes of one kind or another, almost always on something biblical for 20 years or so. And I'm delighted to have a few thoughts to share about the Lord's Prayer. You'll have to forgive me. I have two monster handouts that are yours to be downloaded. Why don't I jump to Dear King James? And I've already shared with you my shocking discovery, and I was shocked that the prayers are identical for the most part. Identical for the most part in the two Gospels within the King James Bible, and that's the only place you're going to find this phenomenon. Just wondering, even so, there are some differences. Anyone want to identify a difference between the two columns here? How about this? Oh, glad it came back. See any of that over in Luke? No, of course not. And what Luke has over here is not reflected in Matthew. Right off the bat, we need to be aware that the teachings of Jesus, and indeed the stories about him, both words and deeds as they're given to us in the Gospels, that was probably all oral tradition once upon a time, and it was free floating, independent pieces, things probably, in fact, never told exactly the same way twice, but for sure, free floating bits and pieces. And to a large extent, to the greatest extent, it was up to the gospel writers themselves, uniquely, each and every one of them, to find a place for either the word of Jesus or the deed about Jesus within the story that the storyteller, that the gospel writer was putting together. So in fact, it's pretty easy to tell that Matthew comes up with his own introduction to the prayer, and Luke comes up with his own introduction to the prayer. And believe me, I can tell you that if we really, really wanted to do this thoroughly and ambitiously, we would have to look not just at the prayer itself, but what leads up to it and what follows from it, because that's not only interesting, it's also very telling for how the gospel writer, Matthew on the one hand, Luke on the other, how the gospel writer understood what was going on, what was happening in the broad sweep of the two gospel stories as the prayer was entertained. You can see the prayer, Matthew's prayer is fairly early, chapter 6, and if you're a Bible student, you know that's smack dab in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount. So you won't understand fully what Matthew is up to with his Lord's Prayer unless you tackle the whole Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5 through 7. But Luke's version of the Lord's Prayer is in chapter 11, so it's quite a ways further down the road in Luke's telling of his story. And FYI, Matthew has the famous beloved Sermon on the Mount in chapter 5 through 7. Luke has a kind of a pale, brief cousin, sibling, or some sort of relative to the Sermon on the Mount. It's called the Sermon on the Plain because Jesus doesn't go up on a hill to preach it, but finds a flat place somewhere and begins to speak. And both the Sermon on the Plain in Luke and the Sermon on the Mount and Matthew have the Beatitudes, but the Beatitudes are radically different in the two Gospels. You don't want it another time. So just to say that we are indeed just scratching the surface here by looking at the prayer itself and how it differs. So the intro in Matthew and the intro in Luke have nothing to do with each other. For the most part, in the King James, the two prayers are absolutely identical, which shocked me when I discovered that in the last few days. Because like I say, I don't spend any time in the King James Bible in general, and I had never I never bothered to look at Luke's version. This you will not find over in Luke, apparently. And FYI, for thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever. Amen. That's not found in the oldest and best manuscripts. And so in the New Revised Standard Version, it ain't going to be there. It's not there because scholars in the modern world in the 1800s, the 1900s, up to our own time, scholars looked at the oldest and best manuscripts, of which we now have thousands and thousands. And we have discovered that the oldest and best manuscripts don't have that phrase. So in an attempt to be faithful to what the original authors actually wrote, this is dropped from modern translations. And manuscripts, I'll let you read this comment here on your own, but very, very briefly. The translators of the King James Bible were brilliant scholars. I think I want to remember something like 54 scholars to start with, and a few retired or died over the course of the years. And so like 47 contributors ended up at the end contributing, something like that. And they were brilliant, brilliant scholars from Oxford, Cambridge, and Westminster. But they were working with, from our perspective, very poor materials. Of Greek New Testament manuscripts, they probably had 6, 8, 10 at the most. And they were late manuscripts, medieval. They had, the text of them had been corrupted because scribes often thought they knew more than they really knew about how to copy from one manuscript to a new manuscript. And so the manuscripts of the Greek New Testament had been corrupted as they had been copied by hand century after century after century after century. It's not, of course, until Gutenberg in the 1450s that we have the printing press, and other problems begin to creep in. So we have now at least 5,800 copies of ancient Greek New Testament manuscripts, to say nothing of the manuscripts that exist in Latin, Coptic, Armenian, Ethiopic, you name it. We got thousands and thousands and thousands of manuscripts that the King James translators didn't have. Their manuscripts had already fiddled with the wording of the Lord's Prayer, and their manuscripts had already made Luke's version the same as Matthew's, essentially. And so the similarity here is thanks to the manuscripts that the King James translators had. We now know better. So I think maybe, if we were face to face in the room and you were all being boisterous with me, you would point out that when we say the Lord's Prayer at 11:15, we don't say which, we say who, right? Because that's modern, contemporary English style. And then there was another, I was thinking, we'll talk about debts and debtors. We got to talk about that. But that may have to wait till next week. At Trinity Cathedral and in the Methodist Church of my upbringing, I was a trespasser. I've been a trespasser, I've been a sinner, and I've been a debtor. And I've been in church life for 71 years, and I I know that if I'm in a strange church setting and it's time to say the Lord's Prayer, I know that when we get to, and forgive us our, I will pause in order to wait and see what that community of faith says, whether they are debtors, sinners, or trespassers. And that alone is a curious, interesting, fascinating study, is to figure out why we have those three terms. Actually, the King James here is pretty darn accurate. The word in the Greek is actually debts over here, debtors over here, and indebted here. So 3 of the 4 occurrences of some word in the 2 prayers, 3 of the 4 are in agreement. This is the odd one out, sins. And that's in the original too. So we need to talk about that as best we can at the time we have available. All right. Now here's where let's move on to a modern translation. And oh, by the way, I have mentioned to the adult formation people, to Adrian and to BJ, that there's a new edition of the New Revised Standard Version coming out. Maybe we should take a look at that. We'll see what happens. But this is the existing New Revised Standard Version. The date I have for it is 1989.
You have a question in the chat. You have a question in the chat about John. Do we know how John taught his disciples to pray?
Oh, well, since John's, you mean John's, the Gospel of John?
Yeah, John's Gospel.
I don't, of course, the Lord's Prayer is not there, nor is it in Mark. And off the top of my head, that's a great question. Off the top of my head, I can't think of a moment. It may be there, but I can't think of any moment in John's Gospel where we get much attention to prayer. I'll have to do my homework on that. Interesting question. Anything else? Any other questions at the moment? I really could use some help here identifying differences, and I'll give you this, since this has already been pointed out. I'll give you this for free, and that's the heaviest lifting, I suppose. I mean, it's the biggest amount of verbiage. What about down here?
Oh, Bob, the question has been clarified. It's John the Baptist. Did John the Baptist?
Oh. Sadly, we have almost zero from John. The question may be inspired by Luke here. Lord, teach us to pray as John taught his disciples. Sadly, we don't know anything about what John taught his disciples. John the Baptist is extremely frustrating that we have so little about him that has been preserved in writing. And what we have is almost entirely, not exclusively, there are a few people in the Middle East to this day who trace their religious heritage back to John the Baptist, the Mandeans in southern Iraq, if they're still there, if wars haven't decimated them. So, but mostly what we know about John the Baptist comes from Christians, and Christians uniformly said that John said that Jesus was better than John. So, and the Christian sources don't tell us boo about what John did to teach his disciples to pray. So sorry about that. Too bad, so sad. Okay, other differences hereafter, or you're gonna make me do the work? There's an hour there. Come on. So it's Father over here, it's our Father in heaven in Matthew. And I think that needs to go with this editorial embellishment. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So heaven, 2 references to heaven. Now we know from the Jewish tradition that God is in heaven. So that's not exactly earth-shaking news, so to speak. But it's interesting. It's interesting. And I think I would argue to you that these are embellishments introduced by Matthew into the prayer. Luke's version doesn't have them. And we still get Father. If you go with Luke, you still get Father. You still get the name of God being revered, hallowed, made holy, given honor and deference, whatever hallowing means. And the kingdom is very big. Your kingdom come. Well, what does that mean, Jesus? Well, Matthew is trying to help us by introducing a clarifying explanation. God's name needs to be hallowed. God's kingdom needs to come. Well, what might that mean? Well, how about it might mean that the will of God at last, finally, in human experience, is the will of God is at last done on earth as in heaven. As my one of my heroes in biblical scholarship, John Dominic Crossan likes to say in his sharp Irish wit, heaven's in fine shape, it's earth that needs the help. And so God's kingdom is alive and well in heaven, but earth needs a lot of work, and the will of God needs to be enacted, performed on earth as it already is in heaven. So this is an embellishment, but it's helpful, and I think it's appropriate, and I think it's on target. And so I don't fault Matthew for that at all. And I think the hour is a nice touch. And I want to say more about that on down the road, probably next week. Jesus is teaching people to pray as he prays. He's teaching them to call God Father as he calls God Father. It is a radically inclusive prayer. Our Father, not dear Father of Jesus, second person of the Trinity, Pantocrator, ruler of all. It's not an adulation of Jesus in any way, or the God of Jesus. It's our God. And oh, by the way, Jesus does not appear in the prayer as a part of the content. It's all about God and the kingdom of God, and it's our Father. And I will hammer on this as heavily as time will allow, that this is a prayer that invites all of God's children to join together as the family of God. And so I think that the addition of that modifier there, our Father, is brilliant. And I think it expresses explicitly what is implicit in the Luke version. Here's the other helpful embellishment, but this is not so helpful.
They see, but it's kind of hard to name them all at the same time, but we've got this and each, and so you've got a lot of people coming back and forth here. But if folks online want to shout anything out, that might be easier than trying to have it come from here, just for the little things. If we have questions, we'll let you know.
Okay,
but you're doing great. We can hear you good.
Okay, there would be some little tiny differences, like forgiven our debtors versus everyone indebted to us. I don't see that as much of a difference at all. But wherever you have actual white space, like our here and white space here, your will be done, white space over here, rescue us from the evil one. That's straightforward, literal translation of what the Greek actually says. Rescue us from the evil one. We say, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil, deliver us from evil. That phrase is rather vague. It makes evil sound like a general principle at loose in the cosmos. But the Greek is actually technically, literally the evil one, and it probably means Satan. So it probably means the devil, and so that's moving that particular petition of the prayer in a certain direction that may not be necessary, may not be what Jesus had in mind. We'll need to talk about this next week. What does temptation mean after all? What does trial mean, which is probably a more literal translation? Trial or test would probably be the most literal translations of the word that's there in the Greek. So we can talk more on down the road about temptation and then back up to debts. We need to talk about trespasses. Where did that come from? But this is the New Revised Standard Version, and this is what we are using day by day, typically at Trinity, and it's used very, very, very widely in many of the major Christian denominations, including the Roman Catholic Church. So, but there's some significant differences, and I would argue to you that the leaner version over here in Luke is probably more original, probably closer to what Jesus offered to his disciples. And I would argue strongly that the pieces I've highlighted over here in Matthew are embellishments from the hand of Matthew. And doing this study over the last few weeks and months, to be honest, I've always, for those of you who have sat through, survived past offerings, such as the last one I did on the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark is my favorite. That's what I spent most of my academic career studying. And Matthew sits right next door to Mark in our Bibles, and in particular in a gospel parallels, a gospel synopsis, which is a tool that does what I've done here, that places the gospel side by side, so you can see much more easily and much more quickly where they're similar and where they are different. And over the years, I've done many of these side trips from Mark to Matthew, or between Matthew and Luke in this case, and particularly the Matthew and Mark relationship. Matthew is basically rewriting Mark. That's where Matthew gets his major inspiration. Luke is doing the same thing. Luke is rewriting Mark. But Matthew has introduced some significant differences, both between himself and Mark and between himself and Luke. And when Matthew's lectionary year rolls around, like what, in another year or so, I might be tempted to approach the adult formation committee and say, you want to do a study of Matthew? I'd like to look at some of Matthew's interesting variations. So no promises, no commitment needed at this point from either of us. So I'm fascinated by Matthew's freewheeling attempt to be helpful and clarifying. And sometimes he succeeds gloriously, and other times I wonder. It's Matthew alone, for example, who has Peter hop out of the boat and walk on the water with Jesus. Ain't no one else got that bit. And that's fascinating. So, yep.
Logical order of the Gospels, and likely which ones are, I know there's some dispute.
Oh, yeah. Dispute always and forever among scholars, but these are the rough estimates of date that I inflicted on my students forever. I would date Mark to around the year 7. Well, back up. Jesus was born 4 BCE or a year or two prior to that, because Herod the Great dies in 4 BCE. So Jesus is born several years before Christ. So file that one away. He's crucified probably around the year 30. The Apostle Paul is at his zenith in the 50s, and that's when most of his letters are written. And Mark, I would date to around the year 70, because 70 is when Jerusalem is sacked and the temple is destroyed. And Mark seems to allude to that historical event in Mark chapter 13, the little apocalypse. See these stones, there'll be not one stone left here on another when all this comes tumbling down. So Mark around 70, Matthew and Luke, we need another generation on, maybe the 80s or 90s. And John, maybe possibly another generation beyond that. I would date John, this is all guesswork, mind you, because they didn't date their documents back then. John around the year 100 or so. So I would say Mark is first around 70, Matthew and Luke both 80s and 90s. John maybe 90s or 100. Okay, so in the red here are the major differences. And again, Luke has a general tendency not to fiddle with things the way Matthew does. Matthew loves to fiddle. Matthew adds insertions. I mentioned Peter hopping out of the boat and walking with Jesus on the water. That's Matthew. Only in Mark, Jesus comes to John the Baptist to be baptized, and he's baptized. Hey, no problem. But Jesus comes to John to be baptized in Matthew, and Matthew has John the Baptist say, what? This isn't right. Can't do it this way. This is all backwards. And Jesus says, no, cool it, dude. It's fine. It's in the script. Got to do it. Got to fulfill all righteousness. So Matthew has these embellishments left and right. And God bless Matthew. And sometimes they're brilliant. Sometimes they lead us down a path that we could not anticipate. So, and maybe I've said enough about rescue us from the evil one. I'm looking at the clock. It's about 10 minutes till. Well, let me race through. Oh, there's something here I might mention, but let me race through the rest of the document here. And next week we'll, to cover the other handout, I'll probably only need 4, 5, 6 hours or so. I've got enough stuff there for a graduate seminar, but don't worry, there will be no tuition bill mailed out, and there will not be a 3-hour comprehensive final exam. Not. This is, my yoke is easy and my burden is light, as someone once said. Here's a reference here to the third and only other version of the Lord's Prayer that we have from the ancient church. It's in the Didache. And if you wanted to look at it, you could click on this link and go see the Didache online. This is a wonderful website, Early Christian Writings. It's voluminous. It has many versions of XYZ. If you want the Didache, which is probably late 1st century, so it's early, but not as early as some of our New Testament writings. If you want Didache, the Epistle of Barnabas, the Gospel of Thomas, this is one place you could go. It's a treasure trove of ancient Christian stuff. The Didache has its own version of the Lord's Prayer, and this is the third and final version of the Lord's Prayer from the ancient church. We got a version in Matthew, we got a version in Luke, and we have a version in the Didache, and the Didache's version is almost identical to Matthew's. So something is going on there. There is a sharing back and forth, presumably, between Matthew and the Didache. So I'll leave the rest of this. I'll leave to you to study. The scholars version, this is done by the Jesus Seminar, the Westar Institute, a bunch of biblical scholars who've tried very, very, very hard to break free. What did I say? Did I mention it? Somewhere in here, somewhere in this document, I mentioned that people like the scholars in the Westar Institute, the Jesus Seminar, they're trying hard to break free of the constraints of familiar churchy language. And so this is modern English, colloquial English, but they're scholars. They are working with the Greek. They know how to translate the Greek faithfully. And they're trying hard to be accurate and faithful to the Greek in front of them, but they're also using contemporary English that maybe most of the time breaks free from old familiar, particularly King James language. Like your name be revered. What does hallow mean? Well, how about revered? Your kingdom established. That's an interesting take. That I think that's appropriate. I think that's very defensible. And oh, by the way, I haven't really made the case. This is going to come up next week, but as our time is slipping away here, I would be remiss if I did not offer you probably my major argument, my major thesis in this whole thing. And that is that how does the kingdom come, or how is the empire of God to be established? Well, look at the rest of the prayer. The kingdom of God means, in this prayer, the bread we need day by day, forgiving, and I think the right word is debt. Luke has messed up here. Luke has stumbled, but he goes back to debt down here. So how does the kingdom come? 1, bread. 2, debt forgiveness, because you're in debt, and this could well be literal economic financial obligation. And if in the ancient world, or even today, if you are a person living on the margins, debt can kill you. And so forgiving debt, being forgiven debt, is big. It was big back then, it's still big today. And escaping the test, escaping the trial, if you want to use the word temptation, that's possible, but it's either test or trial first and foremost. So if it's all the same to you, God, spare us the trials and tribulations of life. Wouldn't that be nice? Wouldn't that make life easier, make life better? And in fact, the test or the trial can be, it's entirely possible that it could refer to actual courtroom trials, or at least a hearing in front of a judge in a courtroom, in which, guess what? Your failure to pay off your debt obligation might result in the loss of your property, the loss of your farm, or even worse, yourself, your spouse, your children being sold into slavery, or you being pushed off into debtor's prison. All of this those things are referred to in the Gospels and in the Bible generally. So going to court, going to trial would follow over debts, because these are people who are poor, and that prayer for the daily bread is not a trivial matter at all. This all hangs together. This is down to earth business. And that's why I think Matthew may be onto something brilliant over here when he says, the kingdom of God needs to come to earth. It's great up there in heaven, but we need it here on earth. And how might it come? How about bread? How about debt forgiveness? How about escaping the judge, staying out of court? And that could be literal, or that could be figurative. Trials, tribulations, tests of all kinds. So real fast. I saw Steve Roberts out there. Adrian, I know, is a Greek scholar. The rest of you, don't worry about this. Forget about it. This is the Greek. That's in there mostly for my benefit. This is a prayer that has been prayed at Trinity in the past, but I don't remember when. It's from the New Zealand prayer book. And it's fascinating. I think in many ways it's brilliant. And it goes way, way, way beyond the old familiar traditional terms. Instead of father, it's father and mother. It starts out eternal spirit, which I think is quite defensible, quite meaningful, quite appropriate. So here is a wildly innovative, fresh, contemporary rendering of the prayer. I think that will do for today.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you all.
Good to be with you all. We'll see you next week.